Okay, let's go over to the wide receiver position. The Sun God, we think he's going to deliver.
Amon-Ra St. Brown, boy, he picked up last week right where he left off in 2021 as a rookie. He was also a stardom last week, had a monster game, over 20 fantasy points. Now he's got the Commanders. Their defense gave up over 17 fantasy points to Christian Kirk last week, so Amon-Ra is in my top 15 at wide receiver. Speaking of Christian Kirk, another player we told you to start last week, and he had a big game, right? I guess money talks in this situation. He had 12 targets for 117 yards against the Commanders. Now he's got a matchup against the Colts. They gave up over 15 fantasy points to Brandon Cooks last week in the opener. Christian Kirk, as long as he's seeing those targets, Jen, should be at worst a high wide receiver 3 or flex in fantasy leagues.
Moving over to your sit list, a couple of guys here that we were high on coming into the season. Or not high, but we thought they would have good opportunity. But week 1, it didn't look so promising.
And let's start off with Darnell Mooney. Now, listen, it was horrible in Chicago. The weather was terrible. It was raining. It was wet. It was windy. So you give most of the guys a pass. This is really more about the matchup against Green Bay, to be quite honest with you. Their defense is going to be very tough against the pass. They're at Lambeau Field. They got smoked last week by the Vikings. They're going to be motivated to put up big numbers. And sorry, fantasy fans, but Darnell Mooney is not even close to being in Justin Jefferson's stratosphere. So Jefferson had a big game against the Packers. I don't think it's going to be the same for Mooney, who barely saw any opportunities last week in that quagmire in Chicago. And I'm also going to fade Rashod Bateman. Now, I get it. Really good game last week, but he only had a couple of catches. He just was lucky that one of them was a long touchdown. The matchup is much more difficult this week against the Miami Dolphins. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers since week 12 of last year. What's more, they've only given up 53 catches to wide receivers in that time and only 1 touchdown, and that's a 7-game stretch. So Bateman is a guy that I would not chase the points on. I would sit him if I have wide receiver depth.